Hi Jim, merci d'être venu ici à Paris pour une interview spéciale. Nous allons parler de l'élite internationale et d'or. Vous revenez juste de Suisse et nous avons plein de choses à nous dire et plein de questions à vous poser. Et donc je vous propose tout de suite de passer à l'intérieur pour cette interview spéciale.
Après vous.
Jim, avant de rentrer dans le vif du sujet, je vais vous présenter rapidement à notre auditoire. Donc vous êtes avocat d'affaires, vous avez été consultant pour les plus hautes autorités de Wall Street, vous avez aussi été gérant de hedge fund. Vous avez également conseillé la CIA et le Pentagone dans des affaires financières. Vous êtes un spécialiste de la guerre des devises, de l'anticipation des risques financiers et aujourd'hui, en fait, vous allez prodiguer vos conseils aux investisseurs particuliers, aux épargnants que nous sommes, parce que vous estimez que la situation est suffisamment sérieuse pour que tout le monde soit informé de ce qu'il se passe. Mais vous êtes aussi l'auteur d'une lettre financière qui s'appelle « Intelligence stratégique ». Vous avez publié 3 ouvrages. Le premier en 2011 s'appelait La guerre des devises, Currency Wars. Le second est sorti en 2014, il s'appelait The Death of Money, donc la mort de la monnaie. Et enfin, le dernier, le troisième, le seul qui soit traduit à ce jour en français, donc le Nouvel Ordre Monétaire 2024. Et vous venez d'en publier encore un 4e. Vos 3 autres ouvrages ont été salués comme des best-sellers par la critique aux États-Unis. Et donc ce 4e ouvrage s'appelle The New Case for Gold, le nouveau plaidoyer pour l'or. Et vous avez décidé de l'offrir, vraiment l'offrir, aux Français, car il ne sera jamais publié en France, enfin jamais disponible en librairie, mais nous l'avons traduit et il sera disponible pour vous et vous verrez comment l'obtenir à la fin de cette interview. Ces 3 livres s'adressent à tout le monde et pas aux élites et aux technocrates ou à la bureaucratie internationale, et ils sont faits pour être lus par tout le monde. Aujourd'hui, donc, nous allons parler essentiellement du dernier livre, The New Case for Gold. Et comme vous l'avez vu, nous avons appelé cette interview le plan secret de l'élite financière pour gouverner le monde et réduire en esclavage les épargnants. Donc c'est un titre assez agressif. Et ça amène évidemment la première question, Jim, c'est qui est ces élites dont nous parlons?
That's a great question, Simone. You know, when you speak about the global financial elite, a lot of people assume it's some deep, dark conspiracy of unknown, shadowy figures. In fact, the leaders of this are very well known, at least to experts. They may not be known to everyday citizens around the world, but it would include, for example, Madame Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the IMF, Janet Yellen, the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Mark Carney, an interesting figure. He's presently the head of the Bank of England, but was formerly the head of the Bank of Canada, and he's also on the board of the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. They're not all central bankers. Certainly I would include the central bankers, but certain finance ministers, Jack Lew, the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, the French finance minister, and a few professors, Larry Summers at Harvard, Martin Feldstein. So it's a group of people. There might be maybe 200 in all, of whom, you know, maybe 10 or 12 are the core, but they're very well-known figures, at least 2 experts.
Bien, donc vous avez ces 4 personnes, et disons un groupe de 200, c'est vraiment ça l'élite financière dont nous parlons. Et donc ils ont un plan secret, mais avant qu'on parle plus en détail de ce plan secret, où est-ce qu'ils se retrouvent? Comment est-ce qu'ils se rencontrent? Ça, c'est la deuxième question.
Right. Well, you know, Of course, then they can always pick up the phone and speak to each other, but in manipulating the global economy, it helps to meet face-to-face, sometimes in groups of 2s or 3s. So they have a regular set of meetings. For example, the IMF has 2 big meetings per year. There's an annual meeting in October and a spring meeting usually in April. Also, the G20 Leaders Summit once per year. It's coming up in September, but beyond that, the finance ministers and central bankers, the G20, meet once or twice a year. There are also larger meetings like Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum every January in Davos. There are thousands of people there, but these elites will be there. And a lot of the important decisions are taking place on the sidelines, not in the formal panels, not in the formal presentations, but private dinners, sort of on the sidelines in the hallways and so forth. That's when they actually sit and cook up these plans to manipulate the global economy.
D'accord, je vois. Donc, dans les coulisses de ces grands événements, il se trame quelque chose. Mais est-ce que ce plan est véritablement secret ou est-ce que c'est juste compliqué à comprendre pour l'homme de la rue que nous sommes?
I call them transparently non-transparent. And what I mean by that is, yes, they do have these secret understandings. We'll talk more about one of them that's in effect right now. But they like to write, they like to publish papers, they give speeches. So there's quite a bit of information out there about the plan for the global economy. The problem is that very few people read it. I mean, people are busy reading their daily newspapers online or on the web or different blogs, but who goes to the IMF website and reads a speech by Christine Lagarde? Relatively few people. But the other problem is, even when you do read it, it's written in a very technical jargon. So you have to be an expert to understand it. There's a little bit of reading between the lines and understanding particular words and phrases. Most of the people who have the expertise work for the IMF or work for a finance ministry. So the number of people who actually have the expertise to understand it, read it, but don't work for them is very few. I would include myself and a few others I could name. But it's most people either don't bother to read it, or if they read it, they don't understand it. And as a result, they're hiding in plain sight. The documents are out there, but no one pays attention.
D'accord, je vois. Donc le plan, il est plutôt obscur que secret. Alors, j'aimerais prendre un exemple. Jim, qu'est-ce qui s'est vraiment passé à Shanghai? Vous estimez que l'histoire qu'on nous a racontée à propos de ce dernier G20 qui s'est déroulé à Shanghai n'est pas complète. Et donc, qu'est-ce qui s'est dit vraiment à Shanghai à propos de ce plan obscur?
Right now, as we speak, Simone, the world is operating under what we call the Shanghai Accord. And that's a reference to the Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accord from the 1980s. One was in a meeting at the Plaza Hotel in 1985, and another meeting here in Paris at the Louvre in 1987. Those were a lot more public. We knew what was going on, and they announced their intentions, and it was basically to stabilize the value of the dollar after the dollar became very, very strong in the early 80s. They wanted to first reduce it and then stabilize it. So it was a plan to basically fix foreign exchange rates. There's been another version of that. It happened on February 26, 2016 in Shanghai, China. This was on the sidelines of a meeting of the G20 central bankers and finance ministers. But inside that group of G20, there was a mini group, I call it the G4. China, the United States, Europe, basically the Eurozone, the countries using the euro, including France, and Japan. They're the 4 largest economic blocs in the world. Together, they control 2/3 of global GDP. So if those 4 groups agree on something, it can basically dictate terms for the entire world. And they were facing the following problem. China needs help. China is the 2nd largest economy in the world. If China goes down, they'll take the rest of the world with them. And the only way for China to get relief was to cheapen their currency. The problem is the last 2 times China cheapened their currency on their own, unilaterally, one was August 2015, the other was January 2016. Both times, global stock markets collapsed. The U.S. market went down more than 10% last January in 2016 and a comparable amount in August 2015. So the problem was, how do you give China economic relief through a cheaper currency without sinking U.S. stock markets and possibly causing a global catastrophe like 2008? The answer was to maintain the peg between China and the U.S. So the China-U.S. cross rate would stay the same, but then you would cheapen the dollar and the Chinese yuan would go along with it, would also get cheaper. Well, who's getting more expensive? The Japanese yen and the euro. Because this is the problem with currency wars. Not every country can cheapen its currency against all the others at the same time. It's a mathematical impossibility. If one currency is getting cheaper, another currency has to get more expensive. It can't be any other way. So if the decision is to cheapen the dollar, keep the Chinese yuan pegged to the dollar, which means a cheaper yuan, then the currencies that are getting more expensive are the Japanese yen and the euro. So that was the plan. It was too bad for Japan, but Japan had a cheap currency for 3 years, from 2013 to 2016. They did not take advantage of that opportunity to make structural changes in their economy. They basically didn't do anything. They just used the cheap currency. So in effect, the elites are saying to Japan, well, too bad for you. Now you have to have the strong currency. This accord was secret at the time, but we've been able to identify it using a mathematical model called Bayes' theorem. Basically, you start with an assumption, which was that the accord took place, and then you look at subsequent data to either confirm or refute the assumption. Every piece of data we look at, 10 in a row, all confirm the Shanghai Accord, because immediately after, Europe said they were not going to ease conditions anymore. They eased a little bit as expected in March, but they said we're not going to ease anymore. That was unexpected form of tightening. Japan did not ease. The Fed made some very dovish comments in a series of speeches, etc. So the setup was, again, euro and Japan getting stronger, dollar and yuan getting weaker. It played out. The odds of that being by accident are 1,000 to 1. It basically would have been impossible, or almost impossible, for that to be an accident. It played out exactly as we expected. This has enormous predictive power. Using this model and using this understanding, we can predict the actions of central banks because we know they're acting in accordance with the secret accord. So this is an example of how the global monetary elite cook up a plan, don't disclose it, we can figure it out using our models and data, and then it has very strong predictive power.
Donc alors, l'accord de Shanghai, c'est faire baisser le dollar, sachant que le yuan va en profiter, puisque le yuan est encore en principe arrimé au dollar. Bien, mais quel est le but en fait de tout ça? C'est la question suivante. C'est à quoi ça sert tout ça? Quel est l'objectif qui est caché derrière ces manœuvres, ces grandes manœuvres monétaires que vous décrivez dans la guerre des devises ou intelligence stratégique?
Well, let's face it. There's one big problem in the world today, which is debt. Too much sovereign debt. Tens of trillions of dollars equivalent in debt. Now, debt can be managed if you have enough growth, but we don't have enough growth anywhere in the world. The U.S. is growing the strongest, but only about 2%. Europe is growing around 1%, barely. Japan has actually been in and out of recession multiple times. China has a higher growth rate, but they actually manipulate a lot of their data. A lot of their growth is from investment, which is wasted. So if you discount for that, their growth is a lot lower. So the whole world has too much debt, not enough growth. That's the problem that the financial elites are trying to solve.
Donc alors, l'élite sait que ce montant de dette est insoutenable et quelque chose de grave doit se produire. C'est ça? C'est correct, Jim?
Well, it's actually unbelievable, Simone. If you include derivatives, not just actual sovereign bonds, but derivatives, it's $1 quadrillion.
Ok, bon, alors je vais traduire pour notre auditoire. Ça veut dire 1 million de milliards de produits dérivés qui vont disparaître, c'est bien ça?
Well, debt is not automatically a problem, subject to several conditions. If you borrow money and you put it to productive use so that the profit from the investment is more than enough to pay the interest, and if you're growing fast enough to afford the debt, then it's manageable. But that's not the situation in the world today. The problem in the world today is that a lot of debt is being incurred, the money's being wasted, and we don't have enough growth to pay off the debt. So this mountain of debt is getting larger and larger relative to the productive capacity of the economy. So again, if you can afford the debt and put it to good use, that's one thing, but that's not the world today. We're wasting the money and we cannot afford to pay it back.
Donc en fait, ce qui est urgent, c'est de trouver une solution pour que les gouvernements puissent rembourser cette dette.
Well, once you're in the situation we described, there are only three ways out. One is growth, we talked about, but we don't have the growth. The other one is outright default, just don't pay it, which would cause a global financial catastrophe. We all know that. But as long as you can print the money, there's no reason to default. The third way out, and the one that the elites prefer, this is the global elite secret plan, is inflation. They have to have inflation. Basically make the currency worthless. So I can say, if I owe you $1 trillion, Simone, here's your $1 trillion. Good luck buying a loaf of bread because I printed the money and it's not worth very much. That's the secret plan. The question is, how do you do it?
Donc d'accord, la faillite n'est pas une solution, ce n'est pas une option parce que ça mènerait au chaos et à l'anarchie. Donc la croissance, ce serait la meilleure solution, mais on ne voit rien arriver à l'horizon. Et donc, qu'est-ce que va faire notre élite?
So we said that the elite plan is to have inflation. They have to have inflation, but the question is, how do you get inflation? I call this the problem of Jaggernomics in honor of Mick Jagger, member of the Rolling Stones band. They had a song, "You Can't Always Get What You Want." So the problem today is central banks want inflation, but they can't get it by money printing, forward guidance, other market manipulations. They have not been able to get the inflation they want. So now the global elites are saying, okay, monetary policy will not solve the problem. Monetary policy alone will not give us the inflation we want. So we have to try something else. And the question is, what is the something else? There are a number of plans. One of them is negative interest rates. And the idea is, so normally you put your money in the bank and you earn some interest. The bank pays you money. With negative interest rates, you put your money in the bank and they take your money away. Now this is designed to get you to spend it. The idea is, well, if Simone knows I'm going to take her money away, she'll go spend it rather than sit there and let it be taken away. But this is the typical financial elite plan. They don't understand real world behavior. They don't understand how people actually think. What people do is they say, well, if you're going to have a negative interest rate, you're going to take my money away, I have to save more in order to meet my goals, whether it's buy a house or pay for my children's education. So people actually end up saving more. They also say to themselves, what signal are the central banks sending with negative interest rates? They must be worried about deflation. Deflation means lower prices, so people say, well, I'm not going to spend it, I'll wait till prices drop and then buy something later at a cheaper price. So negative interest rates are designed to encourage spending, but they actually have the opposite effect. They encourage more savings and less spending. Very typical of these elite plans. They dream up these ideas, but they don't work in the real world. The second thing they're thinking about doing is called helicopter money. And this goes back to a speech that Milton Friedman gave decades ago. And he said, well, look, central banks can always cause inflation. All they have to do is print money, push it out of helicopters. People will run around, scoop it up, and take the money and spend it. Another one of these theoretical ideas that might not work in the real world. But the question is, how do they actually do it? What do they mean by helicopter money? What they mean is you're combining fiscal policy and monetary policy. So on the fiscal side, governments will spend the money. See, the problem is people don't want to spend. They're fearful. They want to save more, spend less, de-lever their balance sheets, not take as much risk. But government's very good at spending money. You would run larger deficits, have more government spending. Could be on whatever you want. It doesn't matter as long as you spend the money. It could be infrastructure, could be defense, could be social welfare programs, benefits, medical, etc. Whatever it is. The government spends the money. This means larger deficits. How do you cover the deficits? Government borrowing. How do you issue the debt? The central banks print the money and buy the debt. So basically you have the government and the central bank working together to spend more money and then issue more debt and then print the money to buy the debt. So that's what helicopter money is. This is very likely to be inflationary. There are two other ways that the elites are trying to get inflation, if they have to. One would be through the IMF to issue SDRs, which are special drawing rights. I think in French it's DTS, Droit Tirage Spécial. So it's a special drawing right from the IMF. This is money from thin air. This is world money. Because the European Central Bank can print euros, the Federal Reserve can print dollars. Well, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they can print SDRs. They can print their own money, hand it out to their members, and then that money can be spent. So that's another way to do it. And then the fourth way to do it, and this is the most, this is the last resort, not something they want to do. would be to arbitrarily raise the price of gold. So a central bank could come along and say, you know what, as of today, the price of gold is going to be 5,000 euros per ounce. Just declare that. And then you would say, if you think that price is too high, sell us your gold, we'll buy it, we'll print money and buy it. If you think it's too low, come and get it, we'll sell you the gold. And in Europe, Germany and France and Italy and the European Central Bank have a lot of gold. The United States has 8,000 tons of gold. Europe has over 10,000 tons of gold. So if you say, okay, so the price of gold is 5,000 euros, I'm a buyer at 49.95, I'm a seller at 50.50. So you make a market, I'll use actual government gold to back up the market, then gold is 5,000 euros per ounce. Now the point is, nothing happens in isolation. If you have 5,000 euro per ounce gold, it also means the price of oil, the price of copper, wheat, steel, cotton, everything else, wages would go up as well. So it would cause inflation. So you basically have four ways to get inflation: negative interest rates, helicopter money, SDRs, and raising the price of gold. They may go to all four. They may try them one at a time and end up with a higher price of gold. But here's the thing, Simone. All of them mean a higher price of gold. It doesn't matter how you get the inflation. Once the inflation comes, the price of gold is going to go up.
Donc, on a vu l'hélicoptère monnaie, et vous dites c'est inflationniste. On a vu les DTS, vous dites c'est inflationniste. On a vu aussi la possibilité d'augmenter le prix de l'or, 5 000 $, c'est ce que vous avez dit, Jim. Voilà, donc ça, il y aura de l'inflation, quoi qu'il arrive.
It's a very, very good summary, Simone, that just to kind of summarize and wrap up everything we've said, there's too much debt, not enough growth. The solution is inflation, but the question, the problem the world is facing, how do you get the inflation? And we've outlined the ways. The first is negative interest rates, which means a war on cash. Second is helicopter money. The third are the special drawing rights, just world money. And of course, the fourth way is to raise the price of gold. That will be the last resort, but those are the four ways. All of them are inflationary. All of them mean a higher price for gold.
Merci Jim, donc on commence bien à discerner ce plan qui n'est pas finalement si secret, il est plutôt difficile à comprendre, mais voilà, on a commencé à remettre le puzzle en place. Donc il consiste à rendre la monnaie digitale, à supprimer le cash et à faire en sorte qu'on puisse siphonner dans l'épargne des gens sans qu'ils s'en aperçoivent, c'est bien ça?
Well, that's right, Simone. We talked about this global elite plan for world inflation and how they're going to get there. We've gone through that in a lot of detail. But that's just part of an even bigger plan. What they want is world inflation, world money, world taxation, and a world central bank, which will be the IMF. So the IMF will be the central bank of the world issuing money. That'll make dollars and euros much less valuable because the SDR will be the new global currency at that point. Of course, which is highly inflationary, which we talked about. And then finally, who controls the IMF, the central bank of the world? They have an executive committee, but it's really the G20. So I think of the G20, which are the largest developed economies and emerging markets such as Russia and China and Brazil and a few others. The G20 are the board of directors for world control.
Bien, ben, tout ça est un petit peu effrayant, mais est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose que nous pouvons faire pour protéger notre épargne, notre argent, notre vie quotidienne? Que pouvons-nous faire?
You know, Simone, it may be too late for small savers to stop this elite plan. They may not be able to do anything about it, but it's not too late for them to protect their own net worth. They can do that. My first recommendation is investing 10% of your investable assets in gold, physical gold. So not gold futures or gold options or other gold paper products, as we call them, but actual physical gold kept in non-bank storage in a safe place. Not 50%, not 100%. You should never go all in, but I recommend 10%. That's enough to preserve wealth if everything else falls apart. For the rest of your portfolio, there are a number of things you can do. I actually recommend some cash. You might not want cash for long, but temporarily it'll reduce volatility, and you can use the cash to buy more gold when the time comes. And then also some private investments and in growth areas, technology, natural resources, hard assets. So there is a model portfolio that we recommend, but it starts with 10% gold.
Oui, alors de l'or, et on en revient au livre de Jim dont je vous ai parlé. Il est maintenant temps de détailler ce livre. Donc le voilà. Il coûte $26, c'est ça ce que vous m'avez dit, hein, aux États-Unis. Donc nous l'avons traduit en français et vous pouvez le télécharger. Et il vous donne plein de renseignements précieux sur l'or, qui est une des façons d'éviter de voir partir votre épargne en fumée. Cette version, donc en français, contient tous les conseils de Jim pour se protéger, hein, il vous l'a dit, il est trop tard pour s'opposer, mais on peut toujours se protéger. Et donc, dans cette vidéo, dans quelques instants, vous devriez voir apparaître un bouton pour pouvoir télécharger ce livre. Mais donc, Jim, nous allons un peu le détailler, et vous savez ce qui est dedans puisque vous l'avez écrit. Et est-ce que vous pourriez nous en dire plus sur ce nouveau plaidoyer pour l'or?
Well, first of all, the title, it's called The New Case for Gold. We emphasize the word new. It's a tribute to a book about 40 years old that came out in the early 80s called The Case for Gold. This had to do with a debate in the United States about whether the U.S. should go back to the gold standard or not. They decided not to as a result of a recommendation of a commission, but members of that commission had a minority report that was publicly available, and that was published as The Case for Gold. So my book is The New Case for Gold. Some of the arguments are old ones, but some of them are completely new. For example, one of the threats to your wealth, people think they have, cash, for example. You might have a few dollars in your purse or wallet, but most cash these days, and most investments, stocks, bonds, everything you own, it's all digital. You get paid electronically, you use a debit card, you use a credit card, you pay your bills online, your bank account is digital, etc. It's all digital. This can all be hacked or erased. Vladimir Putin has a 6,000-member cyber brigade. They work day and night to penetrate Western financial systems in Europe and the United States. They can completely wipe out your digital wealth. It would be gone and you would never know it. And the same is true of the Chinese, the Iranians, Syrians, North Koreans. They're all working on this. And when I say things like this, people say, well, you're making that up. That would never happen. The fact is, it happened very recently. About 2 months ago, the country of Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, had $80 million on deposit at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is probably the safest bank in the world. So you have a poor country with $80 million on deposit at the safest bank in the world. The money disappeared. It's gone as a result of digital hacking. So this is happening all the time. You notice stock exchanges are shutting down for unknown reasons. One of the great things about physical gold, it's not digital. It's physical. It cannot be hacked. It cannot be erased. So I don't know how people sleep at night with all of their wealth in digital form. You meet billionaires. They say, oh, I own stocks and bonds and this and that. And I say, no, you don't. You own electrons. And they can be wiped out and you'll have nothing. So have some physical gold and you're not vulnerable to those kinds of hacking attacks. So that's a new, we weren't talking about this 20 years ago or 30 years ago. That's a new 21st century reason to have gold. That's an example of what's in the book. We have some of the old arguments also, but we have these new 21st century reasons to own gold.
Bien, Jim. Alors, au dos de ce livre, je vois qu'il y a des témoignages de Ron Paul, Naomi Prince, David Stockman, qui est un investisseur professionnel. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire plus à propos de ces personnages?
So, Simone, these three individuals, Ron Paul, Naomi Prince, David Stockman, are all very prominent in the United States, and I was really honored and privileged that they would endorse my book and write favorable comments on the book. Ron Paul is a long-standing member of Congress. He retired recently, but for decades he was the leading voice to audit the Federal Reserve, audit the gold, and to go back to a gold standard. I mentioned the title of the book, The New Case for Gold. Ron Paul was actually one of the authors of the original The Case for Gold, going back about 40 years. And he held hearings and just really devoted his career to this gold standard and sound money and auditing the Federal Reserve. Naomi Prince is a historian and author. She wrote a book called All the President's Bankers about the relationship between central banks and big bank CEOs and presidents of the United States, how they're very closely intertwined. And David Stockman was the director of the Office of Management and Budget during the Ronald Reagan administration. So very much of a deficit hawk, as we say, someone who also wants sound money, and now a very prominent commentator, writer, and blogger. So all three of them represent sound money, critique of the Fed, exactly the same things I believe in. So I was very happy that they were able to endorse the book.
Oui, alors donc et malgré donc c'est les témoignages de ces gens très bien placés, eux-mêmes membres d'une certaine élite d'ailleurs, j'insiste sur le fait que le livre de Jim est parfaitement compréhensible, lisible pour tout le monde et fait pour tout le monde hein, d'ailleurs. D'ailleurs, Jim aussi a fait appel à un analyste français, Gaël Deballe, pour appliquer ces recommandations et les adapter pour un investisseur français et en euros. Gaël a choisi 5 valeurs aurifères spécifiques qui suivent les lignes directrices de Jim et qui devrait afficher une surperformance considérable par rapport à l'or et donc apporter de l'effet de levier par rapport au simple fait de posséder de l'or physique, qui est la première des couvertures donc, que recommande Jim. Et comme vous l'avez vu, Jim recommande aussi d'être proactif, d'où les conseils de Gaël Deballe, enfin la mise en pratique des conseils de Jim par l'analyste Gaël Deballe. Alors, est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire plus sur Gaël, cet analyste qui va appuyer vos conseils pour nos lecteurs?
Exactly. I'm very pleased to be working with Gaël Deballe on their French publications. You know, I'm a global macro strategist, so I sort of work from the top down with big trends. Gaël is more bottom up. He looks at individual companies, individual analysis. He works from the bottom up. We sort of meet in the middle. And again, it's a great team. I'm very happy to be working with him.
Alors, ce livre donc, que je tiens à la main, c'est le livre américain. Il est déjà un best-seller en librairie aux États-Unis. Bien sûr, celui que nous offrons, celui que Jim offre, c'est un livre qui est en français, qui a été traduit. Je ne peux pas vous le montrer parce que en ce moment même, il est en cours d'impression, donc vous pourrez en avoir une version numérique, mais évidemment aussi une version papier. Mais Jim, pourquoi le donner? Pourquoi?
Well, you know, Simone, this book in the United States costs $26. But we're giving it away for free. I thought it was very important to get to the French audience so everyday savers and investors can protect their net worth. I was so pleased to hear that your team was able to translate it into French, get the French rights, and we can give this to French readers for free.
Bien, et alors effectivement, ce n'est pas tout parce que nous avons aussi prévu que vous puissiez lire un numéro complet de la lettre de Jim, Intelligence stratégique, donc qui est en français, qui applique les conseils et les recommandations de Jim et les suit tout au long des numéros mensuels et puis des alertes qui paraissent entre les numéros mensuels, avec donc l'analyste Gaël Deballe. Donc, comment faire? Ben, c'est très simple. Vous avez un bouton en dessous, en bas de cet écran vidéo, et donc vous pouvez vous procurer ce numéro d'intelligence stratégique. Est-ce que Jim, vous pourriez nous parler un peu de ce qu'il y a dans intelligence stratégique, donc votre lettre?
What we do in strategic intelligence, Simone, is we look at the global macro issues that affect investments all over the world. It used to be that you didn't have to worry about it that much. You just looked at individual companies, individual bond issuers, individual commodities, and you could figure out the price action. But that's not true anymore. Everything's become commoditized. We have a world of risk on, risk off, based on the manipulations of central bankers. So it's very important to watch that global macro outlook. That's what we do as strategic intelligence. And I mentioned earlier that the global elites rely on the fact that you're not looking. Well, we are looking. We're watching them, and we're bringing this to readers every month.
D'accord, donc c'est vraiment une veille sur la macroéconomie mondiale, les manipulations par les banques centrales. Pour recevoir le livre de Jim, le Nouveau Plaidoyer pour l'or, nous allons vous demander 4,95 € qui correspondent simplement aux frais de traduction et d'adaptation. Avec ce livre, vous recevrez un numéro gratuit de la lettre de Jim, Intelligence stratégique, Et vous allez aussi recevoir un dossier qui correspond au travail de Jim, que Jim appelle The Big Drop et que nous avons intitulé 2024, le nouvel ordre monétaire. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous parler de Big Drop 2024, nouvel ordre monétaire? Est-ce que vont trouver les lecteurs là-dedans?
Well, you know, Simone, my first two books, Currency Wars and The Death of Money, were written for a wide audience, but they were a little bit technical and a little bit theoretical in parts. The Big Drop is much more practical. It was written for, again, a wide audience, but it has very specific recommendations as to what people can do to preserve wealth in the coming financial crisis. So it's a little bit more of a how-to book with very practical information for the readers.
Donc vous recevrez aussi un rapport qui va résumer tout notre entretien d'aujourd'hui avec les citations, etc. que vous avez pu entendre. Vous recevrez donc évidemment le nouveau plaidoyer pour l'or de Jim et bien Jim, il est temps de conclure pour nos lecteurs. Le mot de la fin.
Well, you know, Simone, global financial markets have come to the edge of complete collapse and the destruction of worldwide wealth twice in the last 18 years. The first time was 1998. That was a crisis that started in Thailand, spread to Korea, Indonesia, Russia, and then finally ended up at a hedge fund in Greenwich, Connecticut, long-term capital management, where I worked, and I actually negotiated the bailout of that fund, so I know exactly what went on behind the scenes. The second time was 2008, when the global financial panic hit. Everyone understands the dynamics of that. And we were just days away from the sequential collapse of every major bank in the world. So 1998, we were close to closing every market in the world. 2008, every bank was about to fail. Now, in 1998, Wall Street bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, central banks bailed out Wall Street. If we come forward 10 years, who's going to bail out the central banks? The next crisis will be even bigger than the ones before. It will involve the central banks themselves. The only one who can bail it out is the IMF. That means SDRs, that means world money, global inflation. But investors are not helpless. They can get ready for that today. That's what we do in strategic intelligence, and that's what we hope our readers benefit from.
Bien, merci Jim, et à très bientôt.